Hello, and welcome. This story is titled First Snow. Before we begin, let's take a moment to pause and settle in. Find a comfortable position where your body can be at ease and your mind can let go of tension. Let's start by grounding ourselves with a few deep breaths. Inhale deeply through your nose, feeling your chest and belly expand fully. And exhale softly through your mouth, allowing any tightness to release. Now, let's do that again. Inhale deeply, filling up with calm, and exhale slowly, letting go of anything you don't need right now. Let's do another. Inhale deeply, and exhale slowly. Now, bring your attention to your body. Notice the points of contact where your body rests against the surface beneath you. Feel the support beneath you, holding you steady and secure. And keep breathing slowly. Let's gently scan our body, releasing tension as we go. Beginning at the top of your head, imagine a soft wave of relaxation flowing over your scalp. It moves gently down, releasing any tightness in your forehead, your cheeks, and your jaw. Let your face soften. You don't have to hold on to anything here. The wave of relaxation moves down your neck and shoulders, gently dissolving tension with each breath. Let your shoulders grow heavy as they settle away from your ears. Feel this wave continuing down your arms, through your elbows, wrists, and all the way down to your fingertips. With every breath out, imagine stress melting away, leaving your arms light and relaxed. Now, focus on your chest. Feel it rise and fall with your breath. Each inhale brings in calm, and each exhale releases worry. Allow this feeling to move down to your belly, letting it soften and relax fully. As the relaxation spreads to your hips, let go of any tightness in your lower back. Let the wave move down your thighs, to your knees, your calves, your ankles, and all the way down to the tips of your toes. Feel your entire body enveloped in a sense of calm and ease. Now, imagine yourself in a place that feels peaceful and comforting. It might be a quiet forest. On this late fall day. Picture this place vividly in your mind. Hear the leaves crinkle beneath your feet, and the sound of wind gently blowing through the trees. Notice the sense of safety it brings. Stay here for a few breaths. In slowly and out fully. Now that we've relaxed our bodies, let's begin the story. Be well. First, snow. The loss of my grandmother hit me and my family hard. It wasn't just her unexpected departure that was a shock. It was also the hole her absence seemed to leave. She was a larger-than-life character who really was at the center of our family. We all gathered at her farmhouse for the holidays. My grandfather and grandmother raised my mother and her siblings in this house. Even though I grew up in the city, going to the farm always felt like going home. Every time my parents and I arrived at the farmhouse, we were sure to hear rambunctious conversations happening among siblings and cousins as we walked to the front door. There was usually no point in knocking, as no one would be paying attention. Upon opening the door, I would be hit by a wall of noise, the smell of baked goods, as well as hugs and handshakes from every direction. At the heart of it all would be my grandmother, usually consumed with cooking or baking as people gathered around her in the kitchen. One of my fondest memories of her is how, whenever things got too overwhelming, she would playfully chase us out of the room while shaking some cooking implements at us. However, none of us ever wanted to be away from her for too long, so slowly but surely we would stagger back in, and the whole scene would play out again. There was, however, one thing I didn't like about spending holidays in this house, and that was the sleeping arrangements. All of the bedrooms were quickly taken up by my aunts and uncles, so I had to sleep in the attic. The attic itself wasn't scary. It was insulated and warm. It felt a bit like a clubhouse. A small octagonal window facing south let in sunlight during the day and moonlight at night. On certain visits, I could see the moon directly from my bed, and I was always fascinated by how much brighter it appeared away from the city. The issue I had with the attic stemmed back to something that happened when I was 6. During one visit, in the middle of the night, I was awoken by a noise I did not recognize. It sounded as though someone was crumpling a piece of paper in their hands, using it to gently hit the wall. My curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly sat up in bed, trying not to make too much noise so I could track the sound. Just as my eyes were starting to adjust, I was struck in the side of the face by something that seemed to stay and cling there. I jumped out of bed, screaming, and woke up most of the house. It turned out to be a bat that had made its way inside and had gotten caught in my hair while flying. My grandfather was able to get it off me and make sure it got back outside. I wasn't injured at all, but being young, I had begun to cry a little. Noticing this, my dad, who had also been woken up, seemed to get embarrassed and forced me to go back to sleep in the attic without complaining. Ever since that incident, I had felt uneasy about falling asleep in that room. I wanted to find somewhere else to sleep, but I was the youngest grandchild, and this was the smallest space. That didn't even matter, though. By the time I was 13, it had almost become a tradition, so it was my place to sleep when I was at the farm, whether I liked it or not. If I'm being honest, I also wanted to prove to my dad that I wasn't afraid. But I was. Luckily, I had a tradition of my own. I spent a large portion of my nights in that room staring out the window, gazing into the expansive backyard that bordered a patch of trees. The soft moonlight was calming. It had a blue quality that I felt comfortable losing myself in. Everything was always so still, and remained so, and so could I. I would just stand there, staring and staring, as my eyes got more and more droopy, until I became too tired to stand. Then I would sit on the bed, and if it was the right time of year, catch sight of the moon through that one small window. I would sit there, again, trying to force my eyes open as long as possible until the light of the moon became too bright for my tired eyes. On most of my nights in that room, the next thing I would recall was the sun streaming through the window and illuminating an old dresser positioned across the room from my bed. This night was different. It was night 1 of a 3-night stay. Despite being a bit older, falling asleep still wasn't easy. So the usual ritual of staring out the window felt like my only option. While temperatures had started to drop for the season, the farm had not had any snow. The moonlight lit the grass, barn, and sheds in that familiar, comforting blue light. As always, I grew tired, and my eyes became heavier and heavier. After closing my eyes for just a moment, I reopened them to find myself sitting in bed. A bright crescent moon came into view, much like the realization I had absent-mindedly moved on to the next phase of my ritual, sitting and staring. I can't tell you how long it was before I was startled awake by the familiar sound of the porch screen door slamming shut, followed by a muttered expletive. My pulse quickened as I glanced out the window. There, walking toward the woods with a small lamp in hand, was my grandmother. The lamp lit the grass beneath her as she crossed the field and entered the tree line. Confused and slightly unnerved, I stayed at the window, staring. I was paralyzed with indecision, not knowing if I should get help, go try to make sure she was okay, or stay where I was. Afraid to make a scene in the middle of the night as I had in the past, I stayed silent and just watched. Minutes later, she reemerged, the lamp casting a warm halo around her as she trudged back to the house. She didn't see me watching her. At the very least, she didn't acknowledge me. The sound of the screen door let me know she was back in the house, which soon fell silent again. Getting into bed more bewildered than scared, I slowly drifted off to sleep. The next morning, the daylight streamed through the window, and I could hear the sound of people gathering in the kitchen. After getting ready, I headed downstairs for breakfast. As usual, my grandmother was hard at work in front of her stove. I took a seat at the kitchen table and observed her while I tried desperately to figure out what she may have been doing outside the night before. When I worked up the courage to ask her about her late-night outing, she laughed it off, saying she was just checking on the barn to make sure the animals were settled. Her tone was casual, but something about the way her eyes darted away made me feel like she wasn't being completely honest. She quickly changed the subject by insisting my uncle tell a particularly funny story from years earlier. Further attempts to catch her alone or press the issue resulted in the same behavior. She seemed to be avoiding me, which was completely out of character. As it often did, my curiosity got the best of me, and as the rest of the family reminisced, I slipped away to search the wooded area where my grandmother had emerged from the night prior. The outside air was seasonably cool, and the sun, which was often hiding behind gray clouds, offered little warmth. That curiosity that drove me outside was now at odds with a fear that was beginning to bubble inside of me as I stood in the liminal space between the open skies of the field and the darkness that emanated from the wooded area. In my younger years, my grandmother had explained the area was off limits as it was not safe. Being an inquisitive child, I had always pushed back, asking why it was not safe. She would explain that it was filled with old, rusty farm equipment and various things that could pose danger to a careless child. On one occasion, when no one else was around, she added that there were things in the woods that didn't much care for our family. At the time, I didn't think much of it beyond the disappointment I felt not being trusted to explore the area safely. But as I stood there, my feet pressed against the hardened soil and peering into the dark woods, that ominous warning from my memory rattled my confidence. I continued to stand there and watch as the spindly branches I could see slowly waved in the light breeze. I imagined they were the long arms of some unknown entity, beckoning me to enter the forbidden space. The idea made me chuckle to myself. Overwhelmed with curiosity, my fears subsided long enough for me to take the first step into the woods. Fallen leaves crinkled under my feet as they were crushed between my foot and the unrelenting frozen ground. The snap of twigs echoed among the trees, mingling with the sound of creaky trunks and clashing branches caused by the chilly breeze. I continued on, and as the open field fell further behind me, the daylight grew dimmer, and I found myself in a type of darkness that was unfamiliar. Despite the lively noises, I couldn't help noticing the absence of life that enveloped the area. The woods felt cold and absent, as if its life force had been drained away. As I walked through this environmental graveyard, I began to hear something in the air that I had not noticed before. The wind had begun to pick up, and during its most forceful gusts, just beyond the whistling of the air among the trees, I could almost hear a distant howl. It was an eerie, disembodied groan, as if a ghost was calling out for revenge from beyond the grave. The thought sent shivers down my spine, but I was resolved to continue until I could find some evidence to explain my grandmother's nightly visit to these woods. Eventually, I reached a small clearing deep among the trees. One would think the light would increase due to the absence of trees, but the darkened gloominess never subsided. In the center of this area, in the exact center, was a large tree stump that quickly drew my attention. The stump was much wider than any of the surrounding trees and must have supported an extremely large tree at one time. Although it was large and somewhat out of place, I didn't notice anything amiss until I got a little closer and saw items scattered on its flat surface. Odd symbols had been etched along the entire rim of the trunk's hued edge. Not only were they etched, but as I ran my fingers along some of these deep grooves, they also felt burnt and possibly oiled. 3 white candles, partially burnt and varying in heights, were placed in the center of this display. Between the carvings and candles were small twig figurines scattered on the remaining surface. I picked one up and examined it closer. It seemed to represent a person. It had arms, a torso, and legs, with each section bound together with simple string. Each figure had a few drops of wax on its back which appeared to hold the string in place. As I leaned forward to pick up another, a voice behind me shouted, "Be careful." I swung around, and in doing so clenched my fist. Standing there was my grandmother. A look of disappointment and worry slowly crept over her face as she glanced toward my hand. In that moment, I realized I had crushed the small item I was observing. As I opened my hand, the various pieces fell to the ground, disappearing among the scattered leaves in the clearing. My grandmother approached with a fury I had never seen before. She began scolding me for going into the woods, and when I explained why, she began scolding me for going into the woods, and when I explained why I had come, she scolded me for spying on her. She quickly calmed down, gained her composure, and began to explain the importance of the display when Without warning, she stopped and turned her head to the sky. I started to ask if she was all right when she hushed me with an outstretched arm, unwilling to break her concentration. Her expression changed suddenly once again. She pushed past me, muttering to herself, and began searching on the ground for what I eventually realized were the pieces of the figurine I had destroyed. She gathered them up and placed them on the tree stump. After lighting each candle, she started the process of rebinding the small figurine. Her movements became hurried. Her hands were trembling slightly as she rushed to finish her task. The wind began to pick up, and I could once again hear the disembodied groans that haunted me earlier. With each gust, the noise grew louder and began to drown out the sound of the crackling flames of the candles and the mutterings of my grandmother. The apprehension I was feeling slowly turned into fear as I became more confused about the entire situation. Feeling the need for comfort, I asked my grandmother if she could hear the foreboding growls, but I was met with silence. I wanted to beg her to leave, but before I could, a dark object, off in the distance, caught my attention as it darted between two trees. My stomach sunk as I noticed another, and then another. I tugged on my grandmother's coat as the shadowy figures pressed closer and closer, yet she remained focused on her task. The once distant howls of these dark entities grew louder and more guttural. The shadows pressed closer, their forms coalescing into grotesque shapes that defied comprehension. They seemed to radiate malice, and their presence felt suffocating. The growling intensified, joined by a chorus of distorted whispers that seemed to speak directly into my mind. My grandmother's chanting reached a crescendo. Her voice enveloped the surrounding woods. The candles flared brighter, and their flames were dancing wildly as I shut my eyes and covered my ears, unwilling to face the approaching darkness. Though muffled, I heard my grandmother holler 3 more words. I was still pressing my hands as hard as I could against my head when I felt my grandmother's hand touch mine. I slowly opened my eyes and lowered my arms. The clearing was now silent. The shadows had vanished, leaving only the faint scent of ash in the air. The cacophony of noises had been replaced by a calming stillness that was punctuated by the odd snowflake falling lazily to the ground. My grandmother slumped slightly, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion, motioned me to help her off the ground. She took my arm in hers, and we headed back toward the house. We walked slowly, in silence at first, the leaves crinkling and crunching beneath our feet. My grandmother broke the silence after extending her free arm and catching a snowflake on her hand. This is when they come. Every year, just about this time. We must make sure we are prepared, she said. Her words left me speechless. All I could do was stare at my feet as they moved along the forest floor. I was doing my best to process the entire situation. As we reached the edge of the wooded area, where the field met the woods, she stopped me and gently raised my chin to force me to make eye contact. Her words were kind but regretful. She told me, "It's attached to you now too. I was hoping the burden would die with me, but it did not, and so now it is your burden as well. I can teach you to manage, but you cannot tell anyone, or they will become bound as well." I had so many questions, and they would all be answered before her passing, but in that moment, I stayed silent as we walked back to the house, arm in arm, comforted by the stillness of the first snow.